I am so excited to be here today with Jess, and we are going to talk about base reality and calculus and how this all fits together with art. And
Yep.
we have something in common there because Jess is an animator and illustrator, and I'd like to hear from you, Jess. Well, the way that I connected with you was through one of Paul VanderKlay's videos where I don't remember. Oh, he was talking about an article that someone had written dissing Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning and saying that it was a scam. And you made a very interesting comment about base reality and how that related to meaning. And so I contacted you and said, hey, can we get together and talk? So I'd kind of like you to go over what you were thinking when you wrote that comment, but then also give us some background on how you got into animation and illustration.
Sure. Um, well, I got into animation and illustration kind of by accident. I went to school for audio engineering, and this was back in 2003. So back in 2003, the whole recording industry was taking a giant dive because the internet surprised everyone for some reason. They were like, oh, internet's changing music. So all the studios were closing down and the big studios were really struggling. So it's available. So a friend of mine who I may even come up in this conversation again, a friend of mine taught me how to produce videos, and because he was a film producer in New York City. And then I ended up working with him a few years later in Texas. We ran a small production company making commercials and doing some marketing stuff. And then I kind of had a knack at it because I always was someone that drew, and I could really easily visualize things. And so when it came to making stuff and animating it, I had an intuition about it that made it, I could understand it pretty easily. So I just kept doing it and people liked the work. And I started my own company. Let's see, it was 9 years ago. It's called Pilgrim Animation. And I just do marketing and animations for businesses and agencies and stuff like that. So, but over the past few years, like, of course, I got into Jordan Peterson and then ended up finding Paul VanderKlay, and then, introduction to the meaning crisis and all this stuff. And I had my own journey through the beginning of the 2000s and till the mid-teens, when I was struggling with my own meaning crisis coming out of, I grew up Christian evangelical. My parents were in the ministry. And so I kind of got an inside look of some of the things that happen inside Christianity. I was very much a participant. And going into my 20s and 30s out of that, it was, it's the classic meaning crisis story with the divided thing between the natural and the supernatural. And Jordan Peterson helped put that together again for me. And then Paul VanderKlay helped kind of put it in a Christian frame that made sense. And then the whole community that Paul's kind of built on Discord and stuff has been like super helpful and super fun to just be a part of. So the video that I commented on, it was about, I think the comment was prompted by, so Jonathan Pageaus had a conversation with Adam Friended and what was it, Rationality Rules. So these two, one's an atheist, I think, one's an agnostic. Rationality Rules was a little bit more opposed to Jonathan's Christian ideas, and then Adam Friended was attempting to make some sort of, attempting some sort of like common ground. And
trying to build a bridge, maybe?
yeah, he was. And really he was Adam Friended was really like doing the whole Jordan Peterson and making everything psychological. And at some point, I forget what it was, but Jonathan Pageaus just got to the point where he's like, that's not how reality really is for me. He's like, reality is different. So it prompted this comment about base reality. Let me just read like a couple of sentences from it just to kind of set the stage. So I said, Jonathan keeps trying to make the case that base reality is not just material. How the material manifests itself for him is more real than the material. It's like manifestation is base reality or something like that. It's the meeting of the material and the unifying principle, heaven and earth. And then I brought in the example. It reminded me of the example of geometry versus calculus that Chris, I forget his last name. Do you remember his last name?
Wilson.
Chris Wilson, because he was on VanderKlay and he was on your channel too. And he was like, there's a difference between geometry and calculus. Geometry kind of builds from the ground up from, Euclidean geometry starts with a point. And from the point, you then draw a line. And then from the line, you make an equilateral triangle. And then from that, you can start developing circles. And geometry just builds from the ground up. It's almost like an emergent thing. And you can get to very complex things. But he makes the point that I don't know much about calculus, so I'm kind of just going off what Chris is saying. But calculus doesn't build from the ground up. What it does is it takes whatever phenomenon it is, and then it assumes that phenomenon, and then it starts making calculations from there. So it doesn't have to build from the ground up. And the power of calculus is you can deal with very, very complex things like waves and parabolas and all kinds of, I don't know the terms because I'm not.
The other thing that calculus does, and I wanted to be a math major, so I actually started college as a math major.
Okay, good.
But I had never had calculus in high school, so I had to take it in college. And the reason that I loved math was that everything always worked out. I loved using logarithms and tables and and formulas and algebra and geometry. Everything always worked out. But then I hit calculus and everything doesn't always work out, or it takes a while anyway with calculus, because calculus, I remember one of the first problems that we had in college is to take a lake and find the volume of a lake. Well, how on earth can you do that? Because you don't know you might know what the depth is at any given point, but you don't know exactly how the base of the lake is shaped or any of those things. And so how on earth can you find an answer to that? And I got so flustered by the paradox of that whole, just of the difficulty of it. I think I hit a combinatorial explosion in my head.
Yeah.
And I quit. I mean, well, I finished out that semester, but I quit math and went on to something else because I didn't, well, plus I was dumb and I was a college freshman and I started drinking and was, out too late at night, and I slept through my lectures and all that stuff. So, but,
see what calculus will do to you?
No, it was the drinking that did it to calculus.
I know, I'm just joking.
The way I understood the underlying principle of calculus is that you can take some very complex problem like this, and by dividing it up into an infinite number of slices, you can then reintegrate all those slices back together again and make a unified whole that gives you the solution to the problem. I mean, that's at least one aspect of calculus. And that's the aspect that kind of fascinates me because, like I said in the conversation with Chris, I mean, distributed cognition is like that, right? There's 8 billion people and we all have our own unique way of thinking and seeing. And if we could somehow unite our visions together, we would get much closer to what the world really looks like, because you'd take all those little slices and then you'd reintegrate them, and then you'd have some sort of we still wouldn't have a clear look at reality, but it might, it might get rid of some of the foggy parts anyway.
Right.
So I was interested in what you said about how base reality is not just material, or what you said, Jonathan said, that the base reality is not just material, but it's the meeting of the material and the unifying principle of heaven and earth.
Mm-hmm.
And that really fits in with something I've just been thinking about a lot lately, is well, what I've been doing for the last couple of years is just thinking about the nature of reality, right? And Paul always says reality rules.
Yep.
Not that rationality rules, but reality rules. And reality, when I think about that, I kind of think what he's saying is that reality, Jordan Peterson says that Christ starts out as a savior, but comes back as a judge. But I think reality is, in one way, is both savior and judge in this. I'm not trying to line that up with Christ. I'm just saying it's that same kind of an idea, that there's those two poles. Because when you mess up and you bump into reality, the reality judges your action as having been incorrect, and you have to adjust and try to line up with reality.
Mm-hmm.
But reality also saves you, because if you mess up by sticking your finger in the socket, the first time you get a little owie, but the second time it might kill you, right?
Yeah.
So in that sense, the learning process that comes along with bumping up against reality actually over time changes you, and maybe saves is the wrong word, but
Yeah,
builds growth into you, maturity.
for sure. Yeah. And so, trying to build a concept of reality from the ground up is an impossible task. And the people that are attempting it, that get anywhere interesting, are so, like, they got giant IQs and they've got all this experience and time to do this. And it's so inaccessible. It's like trying to build the world from Euclidean geometry. You can't do it. You have to take the world and reality for as it manifests itself. And the manifestation is real. And then, and that's what Jonathan does when he's talking with these guys. And the guys just sort of assume, they're like, well, we can assume like a material reality, and then all the psychological stuff and spiritual stuff is happening on the top. And Jonathan's like, no, you don't get to do that. The material is a manifestation of the principle, or the earth is manifesting what heaven has called forth. That's his whole heaven and earth thing. And everything has both a material substrate and then also a heavenly, an identity or a name or something. And so, yeah, because even Paul will talk about like the spirit of geometry versus the spirit of finesse.
Mm-hmm.
So you can think of, trying to analyze something. You can analyze it to death. You can just try to break it into all these little parts, or you could try to dance with it and move with it and participate with it. And it's a different way of behaving in the world and assuming what the real world is. Because if you assume you can sort of logically build up from the ground up, that'll affect like how you go about things. And I'm a very, very left brain person. Like, I love to systematize things and break them down and explain things and define them and all that. But I get stuck, completely stuck. And there's no way out of that logically. When you get stuck in a place, you then have to step out. This is like maybe an act of faith or something, so you can actually encounter reality.
Mm-hmm.
And it's what you're talking about, how reality judges you, but it saves you as well. because then you know what's really there. So, you know, it's interesting because I made this comment months ago and we had to reschedule once or twice, but I'm having the same conversation throughout the past week or so. And it's all about this sort of, so I got into a big discussion with some guys on the Vervaeke server, and they were talking about the 4 ways of knowing. And there's these 4 ways of knowing. One of them is participatory, and the other, there's 4 of them, but the other one
Perspectival, participatory.
I can never remember all of them.
Mary.
Whenever I talk about them, I always forget the words. It's the here, I have it on it's the propositional.
Propositional, yeah.
So the propositional is like things that get defined to a point. And so it's almost the same. Here, I got a little diagram. Maybe I'll share it.
Procedural, propositional, perspectival, and participatory.
Yep.
And then there's Mary's parabolic.
Yep. And well, I was talking with these guys. This may interest you. Let me share it. Oh, I gotta have permission to share. But I was talking with these guys.
I can give you permission to share.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they like Mary's idea of the parabolic, and they really like it. They actually think that Vervaeke was wrong in his model with that has the perspectival in there. So they moved the perspectival out and added the parabolic in there, and they're like, it works now, according to them. They're having their own debate with Vervaeke about this. So he explained it to me, and then I misunderstood him. But it was a good misunderstanding. Here's my misunderstanding of what they were saying. So I made this little diagram. This is a working diagram. This is not Vervaeke's model for sure. This is my misunderstanding of their thing, but I think this actually works better than their thing. So this is like already like 2 iterations out, and I'm not scientific about it at all, but just to give you, this is how I think about it. So over on this left side, you have I put it on the left brain, the propositional and procedural. You can see that like the propositional is a dot, and the procedural is just these dots with lines in between them. So this is like some sort of ordered logical structure. And over here is the parabolic, which is sort of like a pattern or a symbol that you recognize. And then the participatory is like this woven mesh of patterns and symbols. So this is what you actually have to act out. This is the story that you live. And you know, when I talk about getting stuck, I get stuck in the propositional and procedural. And I think our cultures kind of get stuck there too, because like Mary's saying, like we left out the parabolic. And I think it's fitting that John just, you know, accidentally left out of what Mary's talking about, that there's this enchanted, because the parabolic enchants the world. And science doesn't like enchant the rigor and control for science. You have to disenchant the world. You have to get rid of the parabolic in a way. But Mary's like, no, you need the parabolic because it feeds into the participatory. Well, now I'm into this and I forgot what led us there originally, but
can you explain the arrows?
These ones in between?
Yeah.
Well, these are like kind of like ways that these things relate to each other. So when you go from the propositional to the procedural, you do it by like practicing or following. So you're following directions, practicing of procedures. And procedural is like ordering, operation, structure. I have this as like you're building, it's a system. And then when you're going from the procedural to the propositional, you're like specifying or inspecting. You're trying to break it down further. So, And then in order to get,
So let me just clarify there. So then if a scientist were doing the scientific method, which is a set of procedures in order to develop a theory or to find an answer, then he starts using that procedure, he starts breaking the problem down into smaller and smaller pieces,
yep,
right? Okay.
yeah,
And
or
then
even
expecting
building a
individual
procedure, yeah, or even building a procedure out of propositions that you've established.
Yeah. So, but I mean, it goes both ways. That's kind of on the
Yep.
scientific side of things. Okay.
So then the parabolic, we'll talk about the parabolic going in the participatory. And the two guys that I talked to, they actually think these are flipped, but I can't make sense of that. This is how I make sense of it. And I'll just disclaim this again. This is not Vervaeke's model. This is my random, it's not random, but it's how I intuit it working. So it's not a scientific thing. Anyway, the parabolic feeds into the participatory by discipline and imitation. So this would be like the kids seeing their parents doing something and they imitate. So that it's different than procedural where you're following and you're doing exactly what the person's doing. This is more like imitating what a mother does. You're not going like my mother walks from here to there. I'm going to walk from there. You're like, no, a mother makes cookies and the mother says these kind of things and talks in this kind of voice. And then also discipline. So you want to act in a certain way. You have to discipline yourself so that you participate in a correct manner. And then if you're going from the participatory to the parabolic, this would be like some sort of reflection where you're wanting to represent some aspect of the participatory. So this would be, icons, symbols, some sort of pattern that you're wanting to, obviously the participatory is hard to represent. So you'll do it in an image and it'll symbolize it. All right. So going from the propositional to the parabolic is enchantment. This is like what Mary's doing. Mary's enchanting the world again. And then going from the parabolic to the propositional is you're defining. So that's how you destroy the parabolic is you can just get into defining it and slicing it up. And then going from the procedural to the participatory, it's embodying. So you may have a procedure. So the example I like to use is you work on high voltage telephone lines. There's a procedure that you use because you will die if you do something wrong. So you want a very predictable starting point and then result.
Mm-hmm.
And the way you do that is with procedures.
Right.
But, the guys working in the industry for 20, 30 years, they've done this procedure so much, they now embody it. And you'll hear things like, I'll teach you all the things that they didn't teach you in school. School would have taught you the procedural. I'll teach you actually how this works out in real life. So they embody something because there'll be little things that come up. There'll be things that you didn't learn that aren't in the procedure that you have to take into account. So you don't die at the high voltage power line, but these guys know it because they participate in it. And then you can dismantle the participatory by explaining it. You're like, you say, oh, those guys are just doing this procedure, or you can look at someone doing something. You can look at how a fox hunts and you're like, we're going to break this down into the procedure that the fox is doing. So you order it into an operation, but it doesn't necessarily embody everything the fox is actually doing or that the fox does.
Yeah, I have a couple of examples that I think might go in there. One of them is a serious example. Once you learn to ride a bike, which is a very participatory experience, because you're participating with the bike, and you can only learn it by doing it, right?
Yep.
Then somebody can write a procedure on how to ride a bike. They can take it apart and write a procedure about it, but that's not going to teach anybody anything because you can't learn to ride a bike from reading a procedure. That's a kind of serious example. The funny example is that when I was about your age, I lived on my husband and I had a little acreage out in the country and we were trying to do subsistence farming.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had chickens and ducks and geese, and, you know, we were killing the chickens and dressing them out and eating them, and raising calves, and had a big garden and all that kind of stuff. We met a young couple in town, and we got to be friends with them. And the young woman worked for the county agent, which is the agency that, the government agency that's there to help the farmers with their problems.
Mm-hmm.
And she was not a farm girl. And she was tasked with writing a booklet that had a procedure in there on how to butcher chickens. and her little booklet, she read it to us. Her little booklet was, you take the chicken and you tie its legs together and you hang it upside down on the clothesline, and you hang up all the chickens upside down on the clothesline. And then you go by and you just cut their necks off, and then they'll just bleed out, and it'll be very clean and neat and tidy. She has obviously never killed a chicken.
Right. Right.
Because for those who don't know, when you cut a chicken's head off, it still has motion. It's moving everywhere. It'll run around the yard for a while. So it tied
Mm-hmm.
onto the, they would be ramming around, flinging blood. That's what can happen between participatory
Right.
and procedural. Things can get messed up.
Right.
But it seems to me there's something, now I love this. It's very interesting to look at, but where does principle fit in there? Because knowing principles and how principles inform behavior is a very, very deep part of who we are. Where does that fit in?
You know, it's
Principle is more than a
something.
proposition.
Yeah, it's something like an enchanted proposition. So it's almost something that's the parabolic, but it can become propositional. It's something that sits in both those places, because, you know, it's almost like the idea of, like, you know, the idea of love versus a full understanding of love. So you
Mhm.
can have the idea of love and plug it into your logical framework of how the world's supposed to work or whatever.
Mhm.
That's different than having, like, maybe an understanding of love that you have a pattern of. You know, it's the difference between the dot, the point, and the pattern. So it's something like that. That's how I would put it. And obviously,
Well, so there's something else that seems like
mhm,
it's missing to me. And I don't know if you've read any of Iain McGilchrist's stuff.
I've listened to him. I haven't read
Okay.
his stuff though.
I spent a couple of months making my way through the first half of The Master and His Emissary, which is absolutely fascinating book about the left and right hemispheres of the brain.
Yeah.
And then I stumbled upon, well, I think it was Luke and Michael who told me about Esther Meek and covenantal epistemology. And her idea is that there is something about a kind of knowing that all knowing comes through this, I don't know if you'd call it a frame, but so Iain McGilchrist in his book, when he talks about the difference between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere is open to the world outside,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of just draws in, or is willing to receive the phenomena, the
Information.
information, the experience that's
Yep.
outside of me, and bring that in. But the right hemisphere does not sort that or categorize it or anything like that. It just brings it in whole and hands it over to the left hemisphere. So
Mm-hmm.
the left hemisphere doesn't have access to the outside world. The left hemisphere only has access to the right hemisphere. So the right hemisphere brings this in, and then the left hemisphere's task is to categorize it, structure it, take it apart, put it back together again, make something useful out of it.
Yep.
And then it's supposed to hand that back over to the right hemisphere for it to be integrated into the whole person. But McGilchrist makes this argument that there's been some kind of evolutionary problem, and we've gotten stuck over and more stuck in the left hemisphere in the last, whatever, 500 years.
Yep.
Whether that's evolutionary or just a result of sin, I have no idea. But anyway, there is this idea of the right hemisphere being willing to receive, to open itself up and receive from the outside, and that there's something in that information outside that draws the interest of the right hemisphere. So there's some sort of looping going on that, and so it's almost as though Jordan Peterson talks about how interest glimmers out there in front of you and catches your attention, and you start to follow it.
Yep.
So there's that kind of knowing that doesn't really show up in the chart here. In a sense, it's a little bit parabolic because it's kind of a story, but it's also reflective of this love relationship, because the only reason you're willing to let this knowledge in is because you trust it.
Right.
You've established some sort of trusting relationship with what it is that you're bringing in and looking at, and then you're developing this relationship with it the way you would. Once that happens, then it can go into any of these categories. You can bring it in, and then you can participate in it by learning to ride the bicycle, or by, one of the examples she uses is a rose bush. If you want to raise a rose bush, you have to get to know your rose bush. You have to learn to love it and want to know what's best for it, and watch it and observe it and feed it and learn what parts have to be trimmed off, and all of those things. That's a love relationship. And so she makes the argument that we have this love relationship, that knowledge, well, this is where it gets complicated, because the scripture says knowledge puffs up, but love builds up.
Yep.
So there is a kind of knowledge that puffs up. Like, I think propositional knowledge definitely puffs up, right? Because you get all proud of what you know, and you just have to tell everybody else, oh, I know this thing. And but love, if the knowledge that you're bringing in is building you and then preparing you to help build others, then that builds, right? And so, and the other thing I'm going to put in the comment section, or in the information section, is an article that N.T. Wright wrote last year in February. It's in the February issue of 2020 of First Things. And he was talking about knowing to love, loving to know. It's one or the other. I can't remember what it is, but he's going through the whole history of philosophy and theology, and he comes to this conclusion that we have to develop this paradigm for knowing that has to do with this love relationship with the information that we're bringing into our lives.
Yeah, that's really good. I mean, well, let me explain this. I haven't talked about this yet. So this was something that the guys from the Vervaeke server did, and they moved the perspectival in as the frame.
Oh, interesting. I didn't see that part. Sorry.
No, it's fine, because I think it fits with some of the things you're talking about.
Yeah.
There's a certain kind of knowing that frames what comes in. And like you talking about how you experience with the right brain, and then it gets kicked off to the left brain. Like, that's totally true. And then you get stuck. That's it. Personally, like, I have gotten stuck in my life in my left brain, and it's not, I didn't get stuck in science. I got stuck into, just religious ideas or whatever. And, there was paralysis. And so the only way out was through the participatory. And it was a trusting in reality, in a way, trusting in God. And so there is, there's a way, Luke talks about this all the time. Luke, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Luke talks about like the frame is everything. And I think he's right. I think that the way your eyes will influence the way you see. And so I even got into it with these couple of guys on the Vervaeke server. We it wasn't about this, it was about something else, but it ended up we just had completely different frames on the subject. And like it was about the book of Job. So you were saying how you watched my talk with Paul about Job.
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of talking through Job with them, and they would stop me like every couple seconds and be like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "What do you mean?" They're like, "You can't equivocate this and this. Like, you're making a false equivocation. Like, why are you doing that?" And I'd have to like stop myself. And I'm like, "Why did I do that?" And it was a really interesting conversation because they pushed back like so many times, and I'm like, "What is going on?" And by the end of it, I was like, "Guys, you got to understand, I'm interpreting the book of Job through the frame of Christ." And also it's like a feedback loop, because the book of Job also gives me some insight into Christ as well.
Mm-hmm.
But Christ is the main template. And as soon as I kind of established that, they were like, "Yeah, I get it. I understand what you're doing now." And they kind of saw, but yeah, the framing is everything. And so you
Well,
can,
okay. So I'm just going to
yeah,
poke in there a little bit, because I used to say context is everything because of
right.
my experience with art. Because in art, certainly context is like 90% of everything, which I can explain more of in a minute. But after a while, I started thinking, well, if context is everything, then postmodernism is true. And I knew that, I mean, my baseline is postmodernism isn't true. So anything that makes it sound like postmodernism is true, then I'm going to say, no, it's not everything. So
Mhm.
context is highly important. The frame is highly important, but it's not everything. There are other pieces there that we need to find. And there's one other thing that influences the way you see that occurred to me when you were talking. There's probably a lot more, but one of the other things is how clean your windshield is. Right?
Yep.
If you've gotten messed up with pride or resentment or bitterness and your windshield's not very clean, you're going to see the world in an entirely different way. Or
Yep.
if you're talking with another person and you both have gotten jammed up on the left side and you're unforgiving of each other because of all this, like Jordan Peterson says, the 50 arguments you've had before that are simmering under the surface of this argument,
Yep.
then you can get to a place where you're so locked up, you can't make any progress at all until one or the other of you is willing to say, okay, the window is dirty from my side and the window's dirty from his side, but at least if I can give over my own sin to Christ and let him wash the window on my side, we'll see a little bit clearer. And then maybe once we can see a little bit clearer, he might be able to see that the window's dirty from his side, but that's the Holy Spirit's job, right?
Yep.
So I think the frame is very important and context is very important, but the lens is also important, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point.
I had actually fiddled with this 4 kinds of knowledge from a baseline of ignorance because I've never really listened to John Vervaeke talk about these, so I didn't know all these different little pieces that go in with them. But when I heard about Mary's idea of parabolic knowledge, I thought, if the 4
Yeah.
are out at the corners, if it's propositional, perspectival, procedural, participatory, maybe there's some way that parabolic is at the center. and that in order to get from propositional to procedural properly, you have to go through the parabolic. Or in order to get from perspectival to participatory properly, you have to go through the parabolic. Or in order to get from procedural to participatory, you have to go through the parabolic.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know whether this could possibly be true or not, but it just fit a frame for me because of this idea of chiasm. Have you run into that at all?
No.
Okay, a chiasm is a literary method that was used by the writers in the biblical times. So Hebrew writers used it. You see it in the Psalms. You see it in a lot of books of the Old Testament. They also used it in the New Testament. And people who are very skilled at reading the Bible through this chiastic frame can show you a passage of scripture and show you that A prime and A1 are like, let's say verse 1 is A prime and verse 36 is A2 or something like that. And then B prime, and I don't know what the opposite would be of prime, but anyway, so verse 1 and verse 36 are parallel. Verse 2 and verse 35 are parallel. Verse 3 and verse 34 are parallel, but they're narrowing the scope, and they narrow like this all the way into the center. And whatever is at the center of that cross is the main point of that passage.
Mm.
Now, it sounds impossible to think that somebody could actually purposely write that way. So I don't know if people purposely wrote that way or if that was something that was part of the inspiration of scripture, but you can see it in many passages, not all of them, but you can see it in many places. And one time I ran into a teaching that I had done on the book of Genesis about Joseph's life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Genesis. And I started reading through my teaching notes for that. I did this probably 20 years ago for a mom's group. And I realized, oh, wow, Joseph's life is a chiasm, because he starts out in this wealthy family. He's the favored son. He's got this broad future ahead of him. He's really at the top, right? And then he gets thrown in the cistern, and then he gets sold into slavery, and then he ends up in Potiphar's house, and then he ends up in prison. And then he comes out of prison, and then he's given the task for the, for the Pharaoh, and then it brought all the way out to his family. And then the family has so it's this chiastic structure. And Job's life is like that.
Yep, I was just thinking that
thing at the center, right? That's the whole story of Christ. The whole Bible moves to that point of the crucifixion and then the resurrection, and opens up again.
Mm-hmm.
And history, according to Jordan Peterson, hinges on Christ. So that means all of history was leading to Christ and then leading back out again. So it's this chiastic structure. So I thought, well, wouldn't it be weird if that chiastic structure was also a convenient way to explain knowing?
Right.
Right. But I mean,
Right.
that's just that's where my brain gets stuck over in the propositional. I start fiddling with all these diagrams in my head, and
Right.
it can get to be too much. But I liked what you did with illustrating that. I would love to be able to do that kind of stuff. So
Oh, well, thanks.
yeah, I mean, just thinking through, what does a procedure look like? Oh, it's a little graph. Or what does a pattern look like? How would you illustrate a pattern?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of my work is like trying to break things down into icons and little graphics to simply communicate visually, because you can communicate so much more visually than you can just with the written word or with someone speaking, because it's just like it's a bandwidth issue. You have your ears and your speaking can talk linearly, and you can take it in linearly. It's just one thing right after another, but your vision can see a whole picture and then focus and back out. And so like just you know, the neuroscience is that like our visual cortex is so big and robust that you can just take in so much visually. And I've always thought visually anyway. So, you know, I things come together in my mind in little pictures and systems. And so
When you use a visual, it also bypasses all the little buffers that are preventing us from being able to hear something, right?
yeah, totally. Because you can get caught into just like, oh, I know what that word means and this word means, and then now you're not making any sense. But if you show them a picture, you're like, oh, that kind of looks like something else I know. And yeah, you can definitely you know, I think it interacts with the right side more than the left side of your brain, because when you're talking and stuff, it's very much language is just sort of naturally in the left hand side.
Right.
Like even when you're trying to do poetry or something, you're still like, you're pushing language to the edge of what it can do, you know, and it's always going to end up being linear and focus on like definitions and stuff. And it takes someone really talented to like get it to do something else that's more pattern based. Or yeah, that's where Iain McGilchrist's work really, you know, it's useful to know that like one side of your brain is like wanting to focus and the other side of the brain is looking at things as patterns. And
well, the way he had a conversation with Jordan Peterson one time, and he was talking about, well, I don't remember which one of them was saying this. Jordan Peterson was trying to verify whether or not his own thinking was correct based on because Iain McGilchrist has done the neuroscience more recently than Jordan Peterson, that the left brain operates the right hand and the right brain operates the left hand. So and this is obviously not true for people who are left-handed, but just in general, let's say the majority of people are right-handed. The left brain is very tool-oriented or grasping, or, you know, using the hand to accomplish something. And the right brain is exploratory. So the left hand will always be searching around, trying to find something rather than grasping. It's a search mechanism. And so the right brain, so when I paint, one of the things that I do is create a lot of chaos on the canvas, because it gets rid of my left brain getting so hung up on making everything perfect. And I can look in the chaos and I can see, oh, what do I see there? I can just explore. I can just let my mind kind of open up. And is there anything there that would be interesting to pursue, that I could, you know, I could find something new in there and maybe create something out of it. And so it's very much that exploratory thing. And it's looking at the patterns, because chaos produces patterns, even though it's chaotic, there's still patterns hidden in there.
Yep.
So.
Yeah. I really liked when you were talking with Mary about your unity with variety thing, because when you went through like all these principles of art and all the things, you have the combinatorial explosion of like all the possibilities and you're like, got to constrain it. And then the idea that you could come to a principle of unity with variety and the one and the many, you know, that's what Jonathan Pageaus talks about what love is. Love is the balance between the whole and the parts, because the whole, you don't want the whole to dominate all the parts so that there's no differentiation, but you don't want all the parts just to go off and not be a part of anything anymore, because then it's just you get into the same problem, which is just complete uniformity either way. And so it's, you know, I try to imagine what's in the mind of God. Like, what is God trying to do? And he's trying to do something glorious. He doesn't want something necessarily uniform and neat and nice. He's doing something much more confusing and problematic and beautiful and wonderful, that you can't do when you're just trying to like keep things, you know, so organized, and you just can't let things go free either. They just disappear and dissolve. So
I had a conversation with Jeremy. Yeah, I think his name was Jeremy. Jeremy had this interesting idea about the two great commandments, love God and love thy neighbor. And he came to this idea because he had a conversation with a guy once who was trying to explain to him the way some Japanese buildings, I don't know if it was temples or pagodas or something, some sort of building that they had in Japan, the ones that have the little rooftops that come out like this.
yeah.
And apparently they in the old days, they used to take a tree, strip the tree down, and then that would be the center pole of the house. But the tree is still rooted in the ground. So it's still stable. And this is what would give them the stability in earthquakes and stuff, because that tree has this natural connection to the ground and a natural stability. But that's your vertical. And then when they put the floors on the building, instead of nailing the floors, they would put one floor on top of another that could slide back and forth around this, like this, around this tree. So when there's an earthquake, the floors could shift and not tear the place apart.
Yep.
And he thought, wow, he said, that's exactly like the two great commandments, because love God is this vertical, very stable structure, and love your neighbor is the horizontal, very flexible structure. And it has to be that way, because if the horizontal structure becomes too flexible, it just falls apart.
Right.
But if how did this work? Anyway, he mapped the whole thing onto Jordan Peterson's idea about too much stability, too much rigidity. Like if the whole thing is all nailed together, perfectly, then in an earthquake, it's gonna
breaks.
It's gonna break.
Yep.
But if it's not suited in the way it should be, in this flexibility, if there's too much flexibility, it also falls apart. But he had an idea in there about pride, enmity, hostility being tied into that somehow. I'm going to have to go back and re-listen to the conversation.
Who was it?
Very interesting idea. His name is Jeremy, and he works in a
this is a conversation you had?
Yes, I had a couple conversations with him. He works in a factory where he works on fabricating one-of-a-kind items for maybe a manufacturing company that needs a one-of-a-kind tool, or somebody that needs a one-of-a-kind display case. And they figure out how to tool their setup in order to produce this one-of-a-kind thing. He said the funny thing is that even when you're doing a one-of-a-kind thing, you still end up with these chaotic systems. And so he's been thinking about chaotic systems and complexity for a long time. And so we had one conversation about that, very, very interesting conversation. And then we had another one about this idea of his about stability and flexibility, and how they have to be in the right combination in order to be functional. And of course, that fits right in with economic systems and political systems and all of that, because if a political system has too much flexibility in it, then there'll never be any possibility for community and family, and never be a possibility really for individuality to develop, because individuality develops when you have the right amount of flexibility, but you also have the right amount of boundaries and the participation in various groups where you can work together, iron sharpening iron. If you don't have that kind of thing, you never really develop as a person who is well integrated, or where you really know who you are and what you can do. But on the other hand, you can't have too much order, because then you also lose individuality. And so God, if the way God built this into the universe, he has some path for us to achieve that ultimate flexibility and appropriate flexibility that produces the right amount of individuality without too much individuality that causes everything to just fly
Yep.
apart. And
Yep.
it's a very
Yeah.
complicated, very beautiful when you start thinking about it. It's, yeah. It's
I
very,
know. Yeah. I love it. Yeah. Um, One thing to kind of bring it back to that picture, like, I think we lost some of, well, we kind of lost, because we lost the parabolic, because we lost this, this part of, I guess it's part of flexibility. Would that, like, is the right more flexible than the left?
oh, you're talking about politically?
No, I'm talking about brain right
Oh,
now.
brain. Okay. So, yes, theoretically, the right is more flexible than the left, because the right brain can handle paradox,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, it's no
Now,
problem.
so maybe for people who haven't been listening, we should be talking about what Mary means when she says parabolic. She doesn't mean like a parabola, parabolic. She
No.
means like a parable,
Yeah.
like the story verse, the relationship between
Yep.
where we are and where we want to get to, and how do you get there, and what happens in between, and all of those things that happen in the parable. Plus the idea, I think, I'm not sure if she means this, but a parable is like a little data compression algorithm, because
Mm-hmm.
it can be the story that it is, but it can be functional in many different contexts. Like the parable of the prodigal son
Yep.
is not only the story of the son, but it's also the story of the other son, and it's also the story of the father. And the story looks different from each perspective. And of course, it can also be the prodigal daughter, and it can
Yep.
function as a truth, as a principle inside many different lives and many different frames, right? So,
Right. And if we've lost the parabolic, we've somehow lost our way to participate in the world, because the way, at least the way I have it in my picture, that kind of makes sense. Let me put it back up again, just because, this is, to get to the participatory, it's easier to go through the parabolic than through the procedural. Like, and this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to establish everything with facts and then make procedures for it, and then tell kids to go off into the world and experience it. And we're like, we have no idea how to participate in it, because all we have are these procedures. And this, the kids that are naturally, like, don't like propositions and procedures anyway by temperament,
mhm.
they're like, finally I'm free. And they can just go, they start doing stuff, and people are, people are like, how do you do it? And then they write books about the procedures that they did and the proposition. That's what all self-help books are, is
Mhm.
like, it's all procedure that that these people that are naturally participatory in nature, they kind of break everything down. But if you reestablish the parabolic, then all of a sudden you have, like, these pieces that you can build participation out of. So you have the stories, because, like, the parabolic isn't like a whole story or a whole parable. Like, a parable is made up of lots of little parabolic pieces. And
Mhm.
the best stories are, like Mary's talking about, they're really compressed. And so, like, you can open them up and more stuff comes out of them.
Mhm.
And then you can try to apply those in your life, and they work in many different situations. And that would be why one parable would be more valuable than another's, because this is just a parable that's more applicable in many different situations. So instead of, like, to the world has really our ability to actually participate in the world and participate in reality. And it's a kind of a death sentence, because just like you were saying, that the right side of the brain is what is open to the world and how you experience stuff first. And if our whole culture is left brain, that means we're all kind of just stuck, and we're all we need something to open us back up. And you know, this is why movies are a big deal, because it's one of the few things where the parabolic comes out, and this is why music and you know, art is so valuable still. Because it's expressing the things that don't get expressed in the propositional and the procedural. But yeah.
I remember some guy doing a teaching a while back talking about how a wife can more effectively communicate with her husband about difficult issues. And I hadn't thought about this for a long time, but when you were talking, all of a sudden it came back into my mind. He said, if you can tell a story that illustrates the issue, he's going to be able to understand it more from your perspective. I thought, wow, yeah, I'm absolutely no good at telling stories. So I've never effectively built that toolkit for my conversations with my husband, but
Yeah,
that's
well,
probably why, because a story gets through that. A well-crafted story will get through that buffer that's up there that doesn't want to hear. Doesn't want to hear procedures, doesn't want to hear your perspective, doesn't want to hear all that stuff, right? Doesn't want to hear your propositions, but a story, oh yeah, I can hear that.
Yeah, I mean, it gets to something that's really on my mind, which is like, kind of like, where do I go from here? Like, I feel like I've been like soaking in all this stuff from Jordan Peterson and Paul VanderKlay and some of John Vervaeke, and like this diagram, and that's not correct, but at least it's like helping me understand some things. And I'm like, what do I do? And you know, even just this last week, I was looking at this and I was like, it's so dumb to get caught up in all these
Oh, I really want to hear what you're saying, but you got frozen.
Let me explain it over again. You're kind of frozen too.
Oh, okay. So
Am I back?
it might be from my side, but I don't understand how it could be, because I'm on a hard wire here. So
well, let me just start over from.
Yeah. You said it's so dumb to get caught in the.
Yeah, it's so dumb to get caught up in the propositional and procedural. Not because it's wrong in itself, but just because that's not where you encounter reality. You only encounter reality with participation. Like, so even if I'm totally concerned, like all I want is facts. Let's say all I want is procedures for my life, that, you know, basically what I need is to maximize the amount of information I get. And the way that I do that is through participation. I don't get more information through just thinking through propositions and procedures in my own brain, or talking about it, or making diagrams. What I have to do is actually like participate in the world. And that will give me it will give me more than enough information to satisfy, you know, it's, you know, I just see it so clearly now that it's so like contradictory, even if I'm concerned with just propositions. I'm like, if you're concerned with propositions, go participate. You'll get so much information to make more propositions out of, if that's what you're really concerned about. If you want facts, if you want procedures that are going to guide your life, like you got to go participate. You got to go participate in reality. And so for me, I'm like, where do I go from here? Like, what are the things that I need to do?
Well, I've been thinking about the same thing, because I've spent a couple of years on this project now, and and part of me is saying, well, what good is it doing me or anybody else if I'm just always in this idea space, if I'm always in my head space and it's not being lived out. But then I noticed an unusual thing, and that was that one of the other conversations I'm having on my channel is a conversation about the 7 tenets of radical orthodoxy. And we're talking about theological stuff, which I've never been very good at. And so I'm learning a lot about that. But it occurred to me this week when I was in the middle of a difficult conversation with my husband, there's a big difference between knowing something theologically and being able to live that principle in your relationships. But I also noticed that because I've been focusing on those principles of love and forgiveness, radical forgiveness, and willingness to suffer, willingness to take on the difficult task, and those kinds of things, that there was some deeper meaning in the conversation, and there was more of a willingness in me to let go of some of my expectations, let go of some of my pride, and actually walk through the conversation in a way that, although it was difficult, it was challenging, it was painful, it also led to a very good result. And then that same day, my husband and I lead a small group every other Sunday night, and we're doing it via Zoom. And I noticed that just what I'm learning about listening to people and really hearing what they're saying and trying to hear more about what they're saying is changing the way that I participate in this small group. And it's changing my appreciation for all the people in the small group. And it's deepening my love for them and for the whole concept of participating in community together. And so the things I'm learning are sort of percolating into the parts of my life where I'm participating. But my theory about participating is the reason it's so valuable is that that's where you run into the chaos. You don't run into the chaos in procedures. You don't run into the chaos in propositions. You don't run into you run a little bit in perspective. Maybe you run into it. You really run into it when your life is the parabolic, when your life is the parable, or when you're participating. That's when you experience chaos. That's when you have an opportunity to learn through suffering. And that's because when Jordan Peterson talks about each moment you're moving into the unknown, and it's this combinatorial explosion of possible choices, and you have to have a frame and you have to have an aim in order to find a way through the unknown. What's out there in the unknown is the unknown information. All the stuff you already know. If you want new information, it has to be in the chaos that's in front of you. So that chaos that's in front of you, you only ever deal with it when you're participating. So you want new information? Fall in a hole. You're going to get lots of new information. Right? You want new information? Get in an argument with somebody, or try to radically love somebody and then get dumped on, and you learn. There's a million different ways to learn, but it's all out there in the unknown, not in what you already know. So
and there's a sense that you got to have a sense of faith and trust that something good could come of this, that it's not going to be all like when you step into chaos, you don't always get smashed, but there's something valuable that you can take from it. And then
to be able to see that there's treasures lying in the darkness, and to be able to see that the questions that you encounter there are really little gifts to help you to grow.
So one thing on Paul VanderKlay's Discord server that I just started talking about with people is just like, what are we doing? Like, why don't we start some sort of project or something that's above and beyond? At least I've had so many good conversations, and there's new people coming along that are just starting to talk about stuff that they need to talk about. And, so maybe we're at different places, but man, I'm really at a place where I'm like, I got to start making something or doing something. I don't know
Now
what it
you
is.
have a family, right?
Yeah. I've got a wife and 3 boys.
So you must run into plenty of chaos there to
Yeah. Well, just like you were saying, like there's ways I'm participating better with my family
Mhm.
because like, I'll get stuck in the idea of like, well, if I could only teach my kids the right propositional or procedural stuff, but they won't listen, so I just won't do anything. You just get like, I'll just sit here and let them play video games or whatever. And like, no, let's do something. Come on, boys, we're gonna draw something. And they're like, we don't want to draw. I'm like, too bad, we're drawing. And then like, 45 minutes in, they've got little drawings done, and made a little thing. We've encountered chaos and made some order out of it. Like, but it's all those little, it's those little things I'm working on in my life. And I guess that's where you start. You just start little and try to, try not to get stuck in my own mind, because my temperament's like that. My culture's like that, you know, so I gotta
Well,
find
and
ways to break out.
you can't pass it on to your children through propositions. That never
No.
works. When my daughter was a baby and I was in this mom's group, one of the mom's leaders, she said, it's not your job to make a Christian out of your child. It's your job to be as close to the Lord and let him make you the most fragrant believer that you can be.
Yep.
And that will influence your life as a mom, and that will
Yep.
ultimately influence your children. And there, I think back on that now, and I wish that I had remembered that every minute of every day while I was parenting my daughter through high school, because there were times when that got lost in the weeds, and I was just trying to make sure that she got stuff done so she could get into the right college and all that, and that's what created all the damage.
Yep.
It was when I went through those times where I forgot. It's about me letting myself be with the Lord in the way that he can make me who he wants me to be.
Yep.
That's what's going to make me a better parent. And I
sure.
look back on it now, I have lots of regrets over the mistakes I made, but I can also see how now what he's working into my life is making me a better parent now, which is rebuilding some of the damage that happened during the bad times. And so there's good coming out of all this, but I think you're absolutely right about having some kind of a project together. I hesitate to use the word ministry because that always turns into something cliche, but if you
Right.
all could build something together, whether it's building
you could write something,
or building more opportunities for more people to participate, or
Yep. Well, Paul's been doing his estuary thing where trying to get, COVID threw a monkey into that wrench, but just getting in-person groups, because you're like, you can only do so much through online, even though it's good that we have video and we can see each other and all community with people, and Paul's intuition about that is, right on, like,
well, one of
Discord.
the things we do with our small group to get beyond this feeling of just using this frame to have conversations about something important, is every once in a while we'll all have dinner together via Zoom. Everybody cooks their dinner and then we sit down together and we're all eating dinner and we're just having conversation just the way we would if we were having dinner together.
Yeah.
And it's amazing what that does for a relationship, because we build relationship on a different level when you're just chatting, whether you're chatting about the weather or what you did for vacation, or just getting to know what you're reading, or, any of those things. We even did a white elephant party via Zoom at Christmas time.
Did you really?
Yes, it was a blast.
That's awesome. Yeah, you gotta. Yeah, that's one of the things I've really missed is like, I've got a nice church community, and like the church is in the neighborhood, and most of the members of the church live close to me. So like, it's really rare because I live in the suburbs of Kansas City, and most everyone drives 15, 20 minutes to go to church somewhere. But like, I can walk to basically everyone's house.
Wow.
And we all, all our kids know each other, and we all know each other. But even COVID kind of put a damper on that, because people are at different places of how safe they feel. And, so it's like, can't go see these people right now, and like trying to organize some Zoom stuff. And I'm just ready for COVID to be over. It's so dumb.
Yeah. We sometimes have driveway conversations.
Yeah, we do too.
Yeah. Or somebody will come and park in front of our house and get out of their car, and we'll stand in the driveway and then we'll talk, which
Oh yeah.
it is so much better than being on Zoom, even though we're still not together.
I know, right? I know.
I guess there's all
Yeah.
sorts of levels of participation.
Yeah,
Do
for
you have
sure.
any examples of your drawing? Not your diagram drawing, but like I noticed on your website that you had a little video of people walking around Kansas City. And
yeah, I could pull up my uh,
I wonder if my internet is unstable because of the time of day or something.
this is my business. It's loading.
Oh, okay.
My internet connection is unstable. But anyway, I'll fast forward. This is kind of the vibe of things that I do. And so like a lot of it's commercial work. So it's like marketing for businesses and agencies. And, a lot of these videos just end up on YouTube or on the front page of websites and stuff. So, but it's
First you have to visualize that before you can draw it.
Yeah. So usually there goes through like a scripting phase where we kind of talk about the idea, then a storyboard phase where we draw out everything, and then we get into making everything move.
So now you say we, so you have somebody to talk this through with before you start.
Yeah, so I'll work with whoever the client is. So whether it's a marketing director at a business or someone at an agency that's like, all right, we need this animation for this person or this business. And then I basically collaborate with them, but I end up doing all the work, but it's, you have to, consider everything that they need to accomplish and try to get that done.
Oh, that's beautiful. That thing with the bird, what was that?
Data. This is more of it right there. But that whole thing, because they do here, let me see if I can just pull up their website. They're awesome. Their logo is a kingfisher.
Mm-hmm.
And so we did this whole thing where the kingfisher, so that they do data visualizations. So they collect data from businesses, and then they basically create visualizations that are useful, because if you look at a spreadsheet, it's nonsense. Like, it's just a bunch of data.
Mm-hmm.
And so it has to be structured in a visual way so that you can actually like see what the patterns are. And it almost is exactly what we've been talking about. It's like seeing patterns in data, structuring them so that people in positions, executives and whatever, that have to make decisions can see what's actually happening. And then, they can do that. So, but the kingfisher was like a metaphor for that the kingfisher has a bird's eye view kind of thing, and then is able to dive into the water, pull out the relevant data, and then
and you just visualized that in your head, and then you created it on the screen.
Yeah, I mean, it was funny because we were talking about the idea because they had the logo. I mean, that's their logo. And I was like, why don't we do something with the Kingfisher? He's like, I don't know if we want to do that. Well, I think we could do something different. I was like, well, why did you choose the Kingfisher? And he's like, well, the Kingfisher kind of, it's a little bit of a metaphor. It kind of dives underwater to get its food, and how like we go under and really analyze the stuff and we bring things to the surface. And I'm like, dude, that's the story. That's the video we need to do. And then but it's the whole, I mean, when they, so if they're working for a business, they'll get hard drives full of data. So like say it's a manufacturing business, they have sensors on every single machine, and they're counting every single thing that comes off the assembly line and how long it took. And they have so much data collection being done in these like manufacturing facilities or whatever business it is. And it just collects on these hard drives, and it's all ordered by like category and stuff, but they don't know how to make sense of it. These businesses are like drowning in data. And so they have to have all these data scientists that come in, or these visualizers that come in to make sense of it all. And the way you make sense of it all is you have to have some sort of story. That's your goal, or you have to have a goal, and then you have to arrange the data to in like relationship with that goal. And then when you do that, you can then produce like a line graph or a bar graph or a pie graph. And so that's what they do. And then they start trying to find the patterns that would be valuable to the client.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's basically like a sorting process, but it's diving into chaos. Oh, the thing I was trying to say, when they get the hard drives full of data, they actually call it a data lake. Like that's the technical name for it. So when
Mm-hmm.
they have just a bunch of raw data, it's a data lake. And I'm like, this animation's like writing itself. So they get the data lake and then they dive into it and they produce this stuff. So yeah.
Well, you're not going to believe the synchronicity of this, but before
Oh
we
no.
started the video, you and I talked about, you said you were interested in why I thought that art map kind of was a translation key for Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
And so I said, well, I'll just flip through this book at random and find some section where I have
Oh
art
no.
written in the margins. I'm going to read this for you now.
Okay.
I have art written in the margins here. First comes the action pattern, guided by instinct, shaped without conscious realization by the consequences of socially mediated rewards and punishments, determined in their structure and locale by the current social mores, products of historical forces. Then comes the capacity to imagine the end toward which behavior should be directed. Information generated from the observation of behavior provides the basis for constructing fantasies about such ends. Actions that satisfy emotions have a pattern. Abstraction allows us to represent and duplicate that pattern as an end. The highest level abstractions, therefore, allow us to represent the most universally applicable behavioral pattern, that characterizing the hero, who eternally turns the unknown into something secure and beneficial, who eternally constructs the secure and beneficial when it has degenerated into tyranny. And I wrote, the artist and the viewer together bring meaning to abstract art.
Oh, interesting.
So I think that's exactly what you were just saying.
Yep.
Yep.
Same thing. Same thing.
And when you were talking about how they have all this data and they need some way to make sense of it, I had a really interesting conversation with Alex Booth, who's been working on an app that he calls Co-Symbolic, that he hopes will help people experience finding patterns in chaos. And so the app is actually going to produce different screens of chaos and you have an opportunity to find some pattern in that chaos and interact somehow with the app. That's what he's
Interesting.
working on.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was asking me, what guides you when you're trying to find the pattern in the chaos that you've created in your painting, you know? And it's that sort of thing. It's like data mining. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what's happening there? Is there something that's being non-identically repeated? Or is there something where some line showed up that's got some direction that's heading in a certain way? Or,
Right.
you know, we're looking for these little patterns that are there in the chaos. And it's just
Mm-hmm.
like the kingfisher diving into the lake, you know,
Yep.
pick up this string and bring it up.
Yep. Yeah. Um, in my work with them, we did a whole bunch of stuff. He'll the main guy there, he'll go and
Yeah, I lost you.
did I lock up?
Yeah. You said the main guy there, you were at some hill something?
He will he does these presentations at conferences,
Mm-hmm.
and he he talks about pre-attentive attributes. Do you know about pre-attentive attributes?
I've never heard the phrase.
So this is just attributes that get your attention automatically. So it's different. It's some of the stuff that you talked about just with art, but um, it's like differences in size, differences in shape, differences in direction. Um, there's a whole bunch of them, and I created a whole bunch of visualizations for him, like little animated visualizations that show all these pre-attentive attributes, and they're all things that you notice immediately, and they're patterns that are basically just sort of hardwired into us. And some data visualization guys, figured out a whole, categorized them, and it's super interesting because basically you then use those to figure out what data is valuable or what is surprising or whatever is you're always looking for these patterns, and it's all visual, like I was talking about earlier. Just like our visual cortex is so powerful that you could scour a spreadsheet all day and you could be like, you kind of get an idea of what it's like. If you're not a very visual thinking person, you may not make any sense of it at all. Or you may see something like, is that something? Maybe that is something. But as soon as you graph it out, you can understand the data in a second. You can be like, oh, I see what's going on. It's going up, or it's going like this, or it's, you have a better idea of how to do it. So like converting data, all these points into a pattern is like, that's their whole job. And it's so valuable. And there's something, you know, that, that, I don't know, that we need to, I don't know, pay attention to, because that's what like symbols and icons are doing. It's turning some ideas or something into something visual that we can, take in with our eyes and with that part of our mind.
Well, one of the things I like to say about Jordan Peterson is that it feels to me like he's doing the calculus of meaning. Because he had the question, so he
Yeah.
distributed the cognition by outsourcing the problem to all these people like you and all the people on all these servers and everybody's thinking. We're all thinking about the problem. So
Yeah.
I'm going to throw this out for the distributed cognition crowd. In art, there's not only the elements and principles of design, but within that setup, there is something called, and I think this is something that they came to through neuroscience, I'm not sure. And I don't remember all of the parts, I only remember the first three. But there's something called the order of seeing. What our eye sees first. If you're looking at an image, what do you see first? First, you see the value differential. So it wouldn't matter if the painting is black and white or colored. What you're going to see is the value differential before you see the color. So the dark
Right.
and light pattern, well, the dark and light is what you see first. So
Mhm.
first you see value, which I think is very interesting because dark and light also has this big spiritual meaning, right? But
Mhm.
then you see pattern. That's the next thing you see after value. And only then do you begin to see color.
Yeah.
So if you want people to really see the richness of color that you're using in your work, you don't use value differential. You keep all your colors in the same value range. So maybe you could keep all your values very, very light. And if you do that and you use very subtle color shifts, you're going to have, it's going to create a visual shimmer almost for the viewer. And so, especially if you're putting complementary colors next to each other. So if you have a very pale, let's say you have a very pale blue and you put it next to a very pale
Mhm.
orange, but they're the same value. So if you squinted, it would just look like a soft gray, okay?
Mhm.
You're going to see this shimmer going on. If
What's the
you,
shimmer coming from?
it's a visual cortex thing. It happens automatically.
Interesting.
If you take that blue and you soften it to a soft blue gray instead of a saturated blue, then the soft orange is going to light up like the sun, because luminosity comes from the same value, but where one of them is desaturated and the other one is still full saturation.
Mm.
And it only happens when they're very high in the value register, when they're very light. So that
So
kind of,
saturated but really light.
yes, yeah,
Okay.
full saturation, but very light. And then the other one that it's next to is the complement, but the complement has been grayed down, so it's desaturated. They're
Interesting.
riding next to each other. So if you look at some of the illustrators of the past, like 100 years ago, some of the N.C. Wyeth and some of those guys, look at their
Mhm.
illustrations, and they have a sky and the sunlight is just like blazing off the page. Like, how did they do that? They didn't just paint yellow on top of
Blue.
blue or something,
Yeah.
because you don't get anything. But you can go and look, or there's a painting at one of our museums up in San Francisco that I just love. When you walk in the room, there is a sun coming through a rainbow, and it's an old painting, a couple hundred years old. When you walk into the room, it's just like, just blasts you in the eye with the luminosity that's coming off that canvas. It's because the sky is this very, very subtle bunches of grays of varying temperature, but they're all grays. And then the sunlight and the rainbow are the more intense color, but they're all very subtle because that's the way rainbows are. So this
Right.
whole very subtle shift is happening on with the mountains underneath it, but the sky is just blazing. And so there's all these things you can do with color with the visual cortex, but only if you keep the values very, very close. So if you're using mid-tone values and you're keeping the values very close and the colors are very intense, you're going to get more like carnival kind of a look, but you can still create that visual shimmer if blue is sitting next to orange or if red is sitting next to
Mhm.
green. So this is why, like, our holidays all center around these complementary colors, because they set up this visual excitement of the
Yeah.
complementary colors sitting next to each other. But the shimmer only happens when they're the same value. If there's a value differential, your eye will see the value first. So I'd love to find a website that I should look it up, the order of seeing all the other list, because I just remember value, then pattern, then color.
The order of seeing.
The order of seeing, yeah.
That's interesting.
And my instructor told us about that because there was one woman that loved to use color, but he said people aren't even going to see your color if you're using all this strong value contrast in the painting. They'll see that, they'll look at the value contrast, they won't look at the color. So she
Wow.
started painting solely with color with very little value contrast, and her paintings just became absolutely off the hook, radiant, just glorious, unbelievable.
There's a guy on YouTube. He just goes out on the street and sets up a small easel,
Mhm,
and then he makes a little painting on a little watercolor page. I
mhm.
think he does watercolor. It could be oil or pastel or something. But there's a couple of these paintings he'll be using like 3 colors. It'll be like gray, yellow, and blue.
Mhm.
And there was one painting in particular, he'll just paint like a house in like a neighborhood that's got, some light coming on it, some nice shaded areas. And, he's playing a lot with value like you were talking about. But there was one painting, it blew my mind. He's like, the tree there is green, but I don't have green on my palette. And I forget what he said, but he's like made a mix. It was basically just a gray. He's like, it's going to look green when we put it down.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
he put it down. It looked green. I'm just like, what?
Yeah, because of the context.
Yep.
Because he had something sitting next to it that drew the green out of the tree. So that's why I said I used to think that context is everything. I used to help curate art shows for my art group that I was in. Everybody would bring their paintings, and then we have to hang up 100 paintings and, you know, make it a nice show for people to walk from painting to painting. And you get some paintings that maybe they're a little bit weird, because everybody has a different style, right? And some paintings that were maybe new painters that hadn't developed all their skills yet, and then you'd have other paintings by very established painters. Well, if you put 2 paintings together where one of the paintings makes the other painting look terrible, you have not done a favor to either artist, really. So the interesting thing that I found was that no matter what kind of paintings I was working with, if you found the right context for a painting, every painting could look beautiful.
Oh, wow.
So we'd move things around for a couple of hours until we found a place where everybody had a home where it would shine at its best,
Right. That's
So I used to
interesting.
think context is everything, because it certainly is in human relationships,
Yeah.
There's somebody for everybody if you find the right context, and if you have an opportunity to shine for who you
Yeah,
are, and
for sure.
all of that.
Right. That's awesome.
Well, we've been going a long time. This is
I
probably
know.
taking up a lot of your work time. So
Oh, it's all right. Today was not a busy day.
I much appreciate this opportunity, and if you ever have something else you want to talk about, just let me know. I'd be happy to
Okay.
have you on again.
Yeah, I totally will. Thanks for having me. This was really awesome.
Okay, thanks, Jess. You have a great day.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.